I now have a beautiful PowerPoint that I wish to share with you all. Can you all see that? Wonderful. So I'd love to introduce Ayla's Earth Laws Month. This month we have more than 30 online events celebrating humanity's relationship with the living world. Please be sure to check out our program on our website, which is available at earthlaws.org.au/ELM2022. So today we're hosting a webinar entitled Making Ecocide a Crime, an Update from Around the Pacific. But before we begin today's talks, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'm here today on the traditional lands of the Yugambeh people, Bundjalung country, Tweed Heads, New South Wales, and here's a beautiful photo I took myself of my local beach, Coolangatta Coulee. I'd also like to acknowledge the remarkable governance systems the Indigenous Australians developed. This is a map of Aboriginal Australia, and as you can see, there's hundreds of different nations who all have their own laws and languages, and we'd love for you to acknowledge country in the chat. So please let us know where you are coming from and whose country you're on today. So today's webinar, we're going to explore what ecocide will look like as a crime in the Pacific. So we've got some amazing speakers lined up, including our national convener, Dr. Michelle Maloney. We also have John Miller from Hawaii, the president and co-founder of Mana Pacific, a public benefit corporation and the initiator of the Moana Pledge, which is an international initiative to unite the 21 Pacific Island countries and territories to accelerate the adoption of clean energy. We also have our colleague, Lyndon Devantier, who is the co-lead for Stop Ecocide Aotearoa on New Zealand. He's also a freelance coral ecologist and has worked with many international agencies and governments over the past 35 years. And last but not least, we have Alan Webb, who has over 28 years experience in litigation, contract law, commercial negligence, property, resource management, and land disputes. He has extensive appellate court experience and focuses predominantly on environmental issues. So if you do have any questions throughout this webinar, I do encourage you to put them in the chat, and Michelle and I will facilitate these after our speakers have presented. But for now, I will hand over to our national convener, Dr. Michelle Maloney, to introduce herself and to continue on the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina, and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. As Australians, we're super excited to have some guests from across the ditch in New Zealand, and also John Miller, a new friend in Hawaii, to hear a bit about the work that folks have been doing to advocate for making ecocide a crime. I won't talk for too long. All I wanted to do today was set the context for what ecocide is, or what it's said to be, and where things are up to in terms of different folks around the world advocating for ecocide to be recognised as a crime. So let's start at the beginning. From the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, or AILA, from our point of view, we were very interested to be watching the remarkable work of people like Polly Higgins and others, who we were lucky enough to meet, the late Polly Higgins, beautiful and amazing woman. And so we were part of the group that had her give some talks in Australia many years ago, and we were very interested and inspired by her work advocating for recognising ecocide in international law as a crime. Now, there's lots of different definitions of ecocide, and I'm sure our speakers today will talk a little bit about one that is being referred to as the definition created by the expert panel. But what I'd like to do first is mention that for quite some time, ecocide in very general terms could be seen as simply massive damage and destruction to ecosystems, perhaps on a permanent basis or requiring a very long time to repair. the interest that Polly Higgins had in getting it recognised in international law was built on the back of several other mentions and initiatives around ecocide. So the Australian Earth Laws Alliance is interested in the work that we need to do to recognise ecocide as a crime in two different areas. One is the international campaign. So the work that the group called Stop Ecocide International is all involved in is the international work. They are, built on the work of Polly Higgins, advocating for ecocide to be recognised as a crime in the Rome Statute. And I won't go into too much detail, but the main thing to know is that that is where many people are trying to make international law change, so that instead of having significant and vast harm that is caused to the environment simply ignored and not seen as something that's bad, they want to change the discourse, they want to change the frame, and they want to change the international legal recognition that that kind of environmental harm is not acceptable, is heinous, and is criminal. What's interesting is that the first mention of ecocide was actually some time before that, the Vietnam War, during the Vietnam War, and afterwards, people were accusing, particularly the US, of using Agent Orange, a horrific herbicide, and saying that their use of that horrific herbicide to just destroy vast tracts of land in order to reveal and destroy their enemy was in fact ecocide. And I believe it was the Swedish PM at the 1972 Stockholm gathering that actually first accused the US of creating ecocide. And if you go further back, what's really interesting is ideas around ecocide as a crime have been advocated much earlier on in international law, but then disregarded. So it's obviously more than timely that people be talking about how on earth can we change the way governments, corporations, citizens consider and view their use of the living world. Here within AILA, we're passionate about increasing the understanding and practical implementation of earth-centered law and broadly earth-centered governance. We often refer to our work as earth-centered everything. We look across law, economics, education, philosophy, creativity, the arts, eco-spirituality, and are informed by both Thomas Berry's work around earth jurisprudence and the remarkable civilizational culture here in Australia and first laws. So our interest in AILA is in supporting the international work, advocating for ecocide as a crime, but we also have our own working group, really only formed up last year, of a range of lawyers, researchers, academics, and law students looking at what it would look like in the Australian context to recognise ecocide as a crime. And we had a session on this, I think it was on the 14th of September, another webinar in Earth Laws Month. But I mention it because for those in the audience who are Australian, right now in Australia, vast, extensive areas of damage that are caused to the living world by agricultural practices or forestry or other things, they're not a crime. They're completely legal. It's allowed in our system to destroy in order to create so-called economic growth. So we're very interested inside AILA to be part of the rising voices around the world advocating for the international recognition of extensive harm to the environment to be a crime. And we're also exploring on this other side, and I mention it particularly in case anyone listening is interested in joining us, because it's a very open working group. All volunteers with an interest in law are welcome. And some excellent work by Gwyn McCarrick, Rob White, Christina Myers, and others, looking at how in Australia, one way to introduce ecocide as a crime would be to introduce it into our state level criminal laws or criminal codes. And that's actually a pretty low-hanging fruit way to do law reform. However, we know that in reality, challenging large-scale ecological damage speaks to the very heart of capitalism. Governments are not throwing their arms open saying, let's all have a law that recognises ecocide as a crime, because they know that their activities and those activities that they permit to corporations, to other land users and abusers, all of those activities would come under scrutiny. So that's really all I wanted to say, is to just be aware that there's this awesome work going on advocating for ecocide at the international level. And we also did have only 2 weeks ago, Jojo Mehta, who is now the sort of I think, the key director of Ecoside, Stop Ecocide International. She gave a really excellent update about different countries pushing for ecocide as a crime. So if you're watching this talk on a recording, please scoot through the AILA YouTube channel and look for the Ecoside talk by Jojo Mehta, and also the Ecoside session by the Aussies, and enjoy this important update from our other colleagues. So thank you so much, Christina. Back to you to introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, for that lovely overview of Ecoside. I will now pass over to John Miller to update us on his amazing work that he's doing in Hawaii.
Aloha, thank you so much. Yes, I'm John Miller. I'm the president and co-founder of Mono Pacific, a benefit corporation out of Hawaii here. I'm on the island of Oahu today. I'm in the Moku of Kaneohe. And as you mentioned earlier about the Vietnam War, where some of the first ecocide happened, I'm actually a descendant. My biological mother was a 12-year-old orphan on the streets of Saigon during the Vietnam War. And so she was brought to the United States. And this is part of the work that I do now, carrying on for our ancestors. So thank you so much for having us here. I'll do, yeah, I've got a big presentation. I'm going to go by it really quick. And if there's anything we ever want to come back to, we can always change our mind and come back. But yeah, I'm also going to add some stuff here. I was asked to mention stuff about Red Hill, and I can kind of give you guys some information on Red Hill's going on. But yeah, I think you guys did a great job covering Stop Ecocide. Just some other points here that's important to remember is, what we're doing here is going to the root cause instead of the symptoms. Climate change and the loss of biodiversity are the symptoms, but really ecocide is the root cause, that we don't have an ethical boundary or a line in the sand or legally that says, this is not right. It's all about protecting nature, where a lot of our environmental laws oftentimes require a component to basically hurt people and have a damage to but in this case, Stop Ecocide really goes into hurting the environment and making that a crime. And later I'll talk about in some of our work as a developer why I think ecocide is so important as far as stopping it at its very inception. Another thing that's really important, I work with a lot of indigenous, not just the Native Hawaiians in the Kingdom of Hawaii here in Hawaii, but also with some of the Ojibwe, Native Americans and Anishinaabe in the United States. And a lot of them are arrested, protecting pipelines. And, one of the things here is we believe that this law will also provide protections from them, both from murder. We've seen worldwide, I think last year was the largest number of murder environmentalists. But you're also providing, criminal protections of those, protecting our lands and our resources, as well as basically saying that even cultural harm would be a violation of ecocide. But I did just get back from a very cold spot in New York City during the United Nations General Assembly. So we do have some updates from there. The first thing is the official statement at the 77th National General Assembly. The president of Vanuatu urged states to support including a crime of ecocide in the Rome Statute, telling the UN General Assembly acting with knowledge of severe and widespread or long-term damage to the environment can no longer be tolerated. And they also made a UN report A77-226 on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, which will be discussed in October, will also urges the General Assembly to recommend inclusion of a crime of ecocide at the ICC. And for such a crime to include protection for environmental defenders, as we just mentioned again, a very key component to this. Another really exciting change here recently is that Vanuatu is now hosting 2 events with us at the Virtual Island Summit this week. We just recently put that together here, and I will put some of these links here in the chat. Let me know if these don't come through, since you can't see the links, I believe, on the page. But these will be events you guys can sign up for. These will be really informative because there's a lot of confusion that's going on around some parallel work with the Vanuatu ICJ-AO opinion. And so I think they're both very important works. I think the ICJ-AO is more of a performative legal performance to basically kind of get public support. And I think, Stop Ecocide is a more concrete law, but both of them I think are equally important. And these events here, this is a great opportunity for us. We were working in silos, and now we're kind of working together to bring our networks together and share resources, kind of just, and explaining how each one is different and how each one is the same and how we can support each one of those. And then the third link in there is the business open letter supporting ecocide law, which was launched at Climate Week this week in New York City. And the last one, I'm not sure of this, but I'm just going to read it. There's a major section on ecocide law and the Race to Zero Climate Champions, Race to Regulation report, the pivot point. was also launched during the Climate Week. Now I'm going to jump over to Red Hill. For some of those that don't know what's going on in Red Hill, we on this island of Oahu, I'm actually a Navy veteran myself, spent 11 years in the Navy, but we have 14 active tanks that were constructed during World War II. They have about a 1/4 inch of stainless steel walls that collectively hold over 187,000 gallons of aviation jet fuel. And that jet fuel sits just 100 feet above our sole aquifer that provides water for Oahu, our largest population and our largest economic center. And these fuel tanks have been a ticking time bomb. Right now, even still to this day, there's a 27% chance every year that there's going to be a major leak. And over the next 5 years, there's a chance that that leak will be 85 or 80%. And this is a leak of 1,000 to 30,000 gallons of fuel. Just to give you an idea, aviation jet fuel has 4 times the amount of lead as race car gasoline, and it can cause birth defects. Basically, there's an anti-freezing inhibitor in there that even just the inhalation it by a pregnant woman can cause birth defects. And in 2021, we've had spills of 14,000 gallons. And so this is just recently. I guess we'll jump right into our case. We formed Biology Alliance, a group of environmentalists, activists, engineers, and lawyers to basically address Red Hill. And on the way to COP26 last year, in November 3rd, we filed a threat to sue the Navy. We had to give them a 90 days notice to sue them under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. And unfortunately, during COP26, at the very end of it, while I was recovering from COVID in London, we got word that they had spilled 14,000 gallons of jet fuel had been released, which poisoned the water of 90,000 residents in Oahu. Fortunately and unfortunately, those residents were military family members, which then at least caused them to have to address this a little bit more. But unfortunately, the Navy still gaslighted them and denied that there was any poisoning in the water, even though it was later revealed that the Navy knew and understood that the detection levels were at 350 times the safe limit for jet fuel. Just to give you an idea how horrible this was, there was, people with rashes, swollen throats, going to hospitals, and there was even mothers with newborn babies that had babies crying, that didn't know what was going on because they were told the water was safe, and was, basically continuously giving their baby new fresh bottles of baby milk with formula, which unfortunately was then just repoisoning these children. Since that time, we found out later documents were revealed that they had at least discharged 6 times illegal to the Pearl Harbor Clean Water Act violations. So then we gave them a warning, a 60-day notice that we were going to sue them for the Clean Water Act violations. Again, the Navy, denied and ignored our complaints. And then eventually, right before we were allowed to sue, the Navy made a unique change, which I think was very smart on their point, and decided to say that they were going to shut down Red Hill permanently. Which basically, made our Resource Conservation Recovery Act suit, which shutting down expediently was kind of our relief from the suit. So that kind of removed our relief. And so that removed that away until, fortunately, months later, the Navy missed its deadline. And then when they did submit a report, it was denied. And then once they submitted another report, their report showed very significant problems that showed they were not going to shut down in the timely manner that they said they were going to. So since that time, in February, we filed our federal lawsuit against the U.S. Navy with several Native Hawaiian environmentalists, including some other activists in Hawaii, for violations of Clean Water Act, in which we'll be going into discovery, and unfortunately believe we'll be finding, dozens, if not hundreds of more violations. And then with the new reports that came out of the shutdown plan being delayed, we of course had to then re-amend our complaint while we still had a chance, and filed suit against them for the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. So now we are unfortunately in a holding pattern, going to our status of conference meetings, and the Navy has basically given us some ideas of how they're going to try to dismiss the suit, which unfortunately just seems like standard practice, frivolous, arguments, but we'll have to go through this process again and hopefully get the shutdown. But again, one of the most important things that we want to do is get the shutdown, because every day these tanks are still fueled. There's almost a 30% chance that we're gonna have a catastrophic failure, which will not only poison the water of Hawaii, will destroy our economy, our tourist economy, and the water of all of our business industry in Honolulu. Last here is Mono Pacific. I'll go through this very, very quickly. As mentioned, we are a benefit corporation, which means we have a triple bottom line. We have to balance people, planet, and profit in what we do. But our major goal here is basically solving the problems of the Pacific Islands. You know, Pacific Islands are the front lines of the climate crisis. They have been exposed to high and volatile fuel prices. So basically, economically, they're extremely disadvantaged. And, you know, no culture or economy is able to thrive if you have the world's most expensive and volatile energy prices. So beyond just affecting the negative climate change effects and environmental impacts of fossil fuels in the Pacific Islands, we think it's kind of the stranglehold in the Pacific Islands economically. And so one of the biggest challenges here is that these islands are very small in nature for project size and financing, and they're also very spread out and decentralized. So we created what's called the Moana Pledge, which basically combines a fintech solution as well as a policy solution together. Oftentimes, again, we've seen that people have been addressing the climate crisis in silos. Either it's policy or it's software driven, and we believe it has to be both of them. So at the top level, what we've created is a non-binding national compact, basically allowing the islands to aggressively come together and say, you know, along their common needs, which is, you know, address the climate crisis, provide financing and workforce development programs for their islands, as well as address it in a culturally sensitive manner. But at the same time, it's not a binding contract, so that we're not stuck into a treaty, which would require, you know, oftentimes 2/3 of their Congress or their government to approve of the legislature, which, you know, in that case, we believe would provide a significant delay in moving this forward, or more importantly, allow lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry to basically position against ourselves. But at the next level, then this basically project goes ahead and has standard master service agreements in each country that conforms the local country's customs and laws, and then has individual project IPP contracts or power purchase agreements contracts that you see in the normal contract. And in short, what we're really doing here is taking some of the indigenous knowledge. First and foremost, the easiest part is simply, you know, like a school of fish, power comes through unity, and we're trying to aggregate all the islands together. And by bringing all the islands together, it's a multi-billion-dollar, you know, purchasing power, which now rivals a lot of the bigger, you know, countries for getting access to financing. As well in this, what we've also done the Moana Pledge, and it's more language. We've taken a lot of indigenous knowledge and cultural island needs, and then put them in more layman English terms that the Western world is more comfortable with, and kind of using as a bridge to basically kind of put, as we like to say it, put the medicine in the peanut butter, so that way, you know, the banking industry and the manufacturing industry can understand and respect the cultural ways of our islands, but at the same time understand it in the way that they do business. And President Whips during the Our Oceans conference was the first leader to sign on to this. After this time, we then presented the Pacific Islands Forum, and now we're working with SPC and the Secretary of the Pacific, or the SPREP, to basically work with the energy leaders to basically on-ramp the islands onto the Moana Pledge. And now we're also working in a working group to discuss how many islands we can get signed up before COP27, and use this as a platform to demand that they unlock these $100 billion that they've been promising, and letting us know we have a software platform that's moved over $1 billion of financing. We have our islands, we have our projects, and really ask them, you know, what is going on and where's this money? At the very least, if we don't unlock any of that money, we can finally move the conversation over and find out, you know, what is going on, and that money is not really coming. Last pieces here, why in my development work, why I think Ecoside is so important is, I think, you know, developers are kind of the moral compass oftentimes, you know, in developing a community. And I think right now it's capitalism that drives most of our developers. And when we're looking at dollars and cents, that's when we oftentimes don't care about the local needs of our communities, especially the cultural and environmental needs of our communities. And I think Ecoside becomes that moral and ethical compass for both the investors and the developers that I think has been missing. And one of the most important things, I think a lot of times investors at the higher echelons, which are purchasing projects simply on paper, oftentimes don't actually, as much as we want to blame them, you know, talking with many of them, I don't think they truly understand the true harm that they're causing in the communities that they're harming. You know, they're just signing on to a project and seeing some IRRs. And I think once we make this, you know, a criminal offense, you know, at least a good portion of these investors will basically not underwrite these projects from the very inception, which I think is the key, because once these projects get underwritten in the beginning and they gain momentum, that's when we oftentimes have our indigenous folks and activists basically fighting them. But by that time, we're talking about hundreds, if not millions of dollars, you know, as a freight train moving these projects forward. And that's when it becomes almost impossible to stop them legally, and why they become these huge campaigns to try to reverse, you know, this momentum. So I think Stop Ecocide allows us the chance to stop in the very beginning. I also believe, you know, the Pacific Islands are vanishing. We're also talking about deep sea mining, and the Pacific Islands, again, are very small islands that don't have a lot of jurisdiction. And I believe the Stop Ecocide is one of the few avenues that give Pacific Islands a standing in a court internationally that can actually enforce these laws that can basically take away our islands, raise our sea levels, destroy our seabeds and our economies and our cultures. And lastly, here is Fukushima. One of the things that Stop Ecocide does is it basically requires us to make sure that we use science to make our decisions. And so by doing that, when we start talking about dumping water from Fukushima into the water, will be requiring us to use science, and then we can bring it back to a court forum to make sure that science was used, as opposed to using political opinion and making these decisions, which I think, again, is a key factor. Again, I don't think any one of these things is a solid win as far as protecting the environment, but each one of them, I think, provides a separate avenue of protection that I think is desperately needed in our current fight. Lastly, but not least, a shameless plug here. There's a QR code if you guys do want to invest. We are doing just what's called an expression of interest. One thing we are doing right now is trying to open up crowdfunding. Just like typically people that are able to invest and reap the benefits of addressing the climate crisis are the wealthy. We're making them wealthier. So I am trying to convince my board by doing this expression of interest to show there's enough people that want to invest in these companies. So in this case, you can invest as little as $100 and you can get $500 to $1,300 return on investment potentially for doing it. Again, this is just an expression of interest. And our next round in 2 weeks here, we'll be launching another campaign once we pass legal scrutiny. We're going to try to open up a quarter of our crowdfunding round to female, African-American, and Hispanic investors, as well as Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and Native Hawaiians, and transgenders that basically typically do not hold assets, and trying to reserve, again, a position for them to get involved into these projects. Because just like the Moana Pledge is trying to reduce the energy costs to provide significant energy savings and a stable economy for the Pacific Islands, we also wanted to make sure that those investing in our company and helping make this a reality we're trying to open up, that to the underserved and underprivileged. Again, so thank you so much. Appreciate this. And thank you for hosting me. Aloha.
Thank you so much, John, for that excellent and informative presentation. It's great to have on the ground updates from New York Climate Week and to hear about the great work you're doing in terms of Red Hill and other campaigns. So thank you so much. And if there's any way we can support your work, please put links in the chat so we can help you. I'm now going to pass over to my dear colleague, Lyndon, who is the co-lead for Stop Ecocide Otawara or New Zealand.
Thank you, Christina. Can everybody hear me? And can you see the screen? I guess they're the two important things to start with. Well, good. Greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Across the ditch as from Aussie. Very nice to be engaging with our Australian colleagues. And, we're one national team, part of 35 now, national teams that are supporting this international initiative. So it's growing in leaps and bounds, as John mentioned. There's a very, very strong push. And why? Why are we doing it? I think those of us who think about these things, and I come from an ecological background, but I know that the legal side of it is very crucial. But I think the principle is that the Earth's biodiversity has immense intrinsic value beyond human accounting. That I think has been lost in a lot of the thinking in terms of extractivism. The frontier mentality of what can we get from here, rather than what is these magnificent places and the biodiversity that we share, which is part of it. So the way that ecologists and others have tried to bring this into the mainstream has been via the ecosystem services or the natural capital ideas. I won't go into it. We all know that our biosphere is basically why we're present here. So why an international crime? Well, we've been signing treaties. New Zealand's a signatory to many, Australia's a signatory to many. The treaties are not doing what they're meant to do. The 2020 goals of the HE Biodiversity Summit failed. So now we're going to develop new targets. So treaties are fine, they're well and good. It gets nations talking to each other, but it doesn't put a line in the sand in the hard legal terms. So that's why we're focused on an international crime rather than yet more treaties. Now, New Zealand, for those of you who don't know, I'm just going to give you a very, very brief rundown on New Zealand. It's, as you would likely know, it's a biological ark of Gondwanan origin. It's been isolated for 80 million years. Its flora and flora reflect the origin, along with episodic dispersal events, mostly coming in the westerly winds from Australia. The Shaky Isles, diverse temperate habitats, alpine to seamounts to the deep sea, typical evolutionary processes, and unknown to humanity until the latest figures are about 800 years, a bit less perhaps, when the first voyages from the Pacific made it here. Subsequently, in that time, the changes to this country have been immense. And like many places, wars, land ownership, biological introductions, extinction events. And it's taken a long while for governments to actually come to grips with this. And this is slowly happening now at the three levels of government that we have here, local, regional, and national. They're beginning to recognize the issues with policy and legislative changes. But as John pointed out also, it's not that simple. So just to give you a sense of what's happened, this is showing the forest cover, and you can see that New Zealand, if we were looking at ecocide as a historical crime, and the definition does not include any retrospective assessment, but New Zealand's lost over half its forest. In terms of the situation with water quality here, the reds are bad, the greens are good, and the blacks, we just don't know what's going on. It's very much a mixed bag, but the situation is like many places. It's there's some good things happening and there's some not so good things happening. Many people know of the historical extinctions that occurred here. The moa are the famous ones, but there were more than 50 bird species lost since humans arrived. 3 frogs, 3 lizards, 1 bird at least. One plant. So a number of things have gone extinct, and there's the list of threatened species is significant. The impacts that we have currently, generally, I suppose you could say these are the ones that are pretty much everywhere. Just intensity is the issue. Agriculture is very intense here, industrial dairying. We have mining both on and offshore, and particular destructive mining for open cast mining for coal in the South Island of New Zealand in the habitat of endemic species, and offshore there's a push for seabed mining. It's still in the courts. Forestry, there's a lot of introduced forest of the Monterey pine, fisheries, and big issues in terms of the trawling of seamounts by a number of New Zealand companies, and then the usual issues with urbanisation. As Michelle introduced at the beginning, Polly Higgins really was a driver of getting Ecoside back into the public mindset, and she visited New Zealand back in 2010, and subsequently people got interested in it, and so there was an early thesis that was done looking at a case study using an early definition of ecocide. And that was the conclusion was that it is highly likely that while size may be problematic, instances of dairy effluent discharge would be of a requisite impact and duration, thereby satisfying the definition. So there's some early work done here, and Nicholson also concluded that it would likely apply to a new type of environmental harm with a rather large domestic scope than the examples given by the campaign. Ecoside would indeed hold liable certain key players currently escaping liability under the Resource Management Act. Now, the Resource Management Act is the main environmental legislation in New Zealand. It's currently being amended. And at this point, if Alan's there, I'm going to hand over to him to from New Zealand.
Well, thanks, Lyndon, and kia ora, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting us to share with you the New Zealand experiences on Ecoside, and to let you know that in the normal way, Australia's little brother is putting our hand up and saying, yep, we're here as well. And the beautiful thing about the Ecoside campaign is that everyone should have equal amount of input to it. So in New Zealand, we don't have any current legislation addressing ecocide issues per se. What we've got is a range of environmental and environmental protection legislation that deals with issues arising within our own borders. And our main one, and that domestic legislation has a sustainable management purpose. So that in New Zealand, we're striving always to strike the balance between being able to undertake development, but at the same time, preserving our natural and physical resources. And that's the purpose of the RMA. We call it the Resource Management Act in New Zealand. And that's about to be replaced with several new pieces of legislation. But you can see there we've got a Fisheries Act, a Wildlife Act, and what have you. And down the bottom, you can see that we've also ratified a number of international treaties. And so they deal with issues outside our territorial boundaries. And New Zealand is a signatory to the International Criminal Court. It's signed their own treaty, and New Zealand's got its own domestic implementing legislation to make it bound by statute to cooperate in terms of the International Criminal Court, just as Australia has. And Australia, in fact, was very instrumental. Some of the people that were at the various conferences were instrumental in the development of their own statute. So, next slide, Lyndon. That's a picture of the International Criminal Court, and the reason that the Ecocide campaign is directed towards the ICC is it's a criminal statute, and it's the only existing mechanism, international mechanism, that attaches criminal responsibility for certain acts. And there's 4 crimes under the ICC legislation at the moment, and it's dealing mainly with armed conflict. So we've got genocide, we've got crimes against humanity, we've got just criminal actions, and we're going to, the campaign is directed at including ecocide as the 5th crime under international law. And the difference between, say, signing up to obligations under the International Criminal Court and signing and ratifying various other treaties is that this all of a sudden will create accountability for not only heads of state, but also for CEOs and other people that are responsible for committing acts of ecocide. And so the next slide, Lyndon. The 2 guiding principles under the definition that's being worked on at the moment are basically to do no harm and to have an ethical duty of care. So that what the campaign is directed at doing is that if a crime of ecocide is defined, and if it's included as an international crime and it's actionable, it'll create some accountability to consider decisions bearing in mind the impact on our relationship with the natural world and other species in the current and future generations. And that last bit about the current and future generations is obviously very important, so that people are doing the work now to ensure that there's still some sort of ecosystem in existence for future generations. And we say that Ecoside sits at the intersection of Indigenous worldviews and knowledge, international criminal law, politics, environmental advocacy, and nature connections. So in New Zealand, next slide, the thesis of Ecoside has been tested amongst Maori leaders and philosophers and scientists and other advocates. And we're confident that an international law to that effect would align with our Indigenous principles such as kaiakitanga, which is guardianship and tapu sacred, and restoring balance within the ecosystems in New Zealand, so that we don't see any conflict between having an international law to that effect and the sorts of principles that we try and organise ourselves, our development aspirations in New Zealand. And so we see it as a good fit and a natural continuation of what our domestic legislation is already trying to achieve. Now, of course, we'll be carrying on those conversations as the campaign continues, and we're always interested in other Indigenous worldviews or state views that'll complement the way that we see the world. So we think it's a good idea to focus on the International Criminal Court for two core reasons. You got that next slide? Yeah. So there's an issue of coherence with an international law. I mean, is effectively an environmental bottom line or a universal standard, so that everyone in the world understands what would and what would not constitute an international crime. And then the thinking is that would then transfer down into the domestic legislation, so that when particular companies or particular governments are deciding to do a particular act, they can measure the implications of that act against what is a coherent international law and see whether or not it would induce any culpability for ecocide. And if you've got that train of thought internationally and these bottom lines, then it creates a sense of solidarity, so that if a major state is doing an action that affecting a group of minor states, then all of a sudden they're not out on their own, and that it's the world community that will be looking at the major state to condemn whatever actions they're taking. So we call those coherence and solidarity, and we think that they're two really important principles that can underpin the success of this sort of crime. The success of having this sort of action identified as an international crime. So to get ecocide recognised as a crime under the International Criminal Court, we need the support from 2/3 of the states that are already parties to the ICC. So that's 82 of the 123 states. And New Zealand and Australia, as states parties, will have a voice in the vote. And we've got a Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade that would promote this, and ultimately we need our cabinet approval. And so there's been progress towards reaching the stage of Ecoside in New Zealand so that the government of the day can understand what's required, and we can get cabinet approval to support any proposal that's put up to include it. So in New Zealand, our plans for the immediate future are all about raising awareness, including government and political parties, and creating relationships with organisations. And we're continuing following up with the relevant New Zealand government ministries and the Assembly, and there's a new Assembly of States parties of the International Criminal Court in December of this year. So it's a very much an awareness and information campaign in New Zealand, and it's about getting people involved. And the next slide will show that we've got 280 groups signed up as Earth Protectors in New Zealand, and we disseminate information through various channels, both on the internet and YouTube and what have you. So that's a very, very quick rundown about what's happening with the Ecoside campaign in New Zealand.
Thank you so much to our New Zealand colleagues, Lyndon and Alan, for that great presentation about your work. I'll now ask Michelle to facilitate our questions and answers.
I'm on mute. Hello, and thank you so much. Yes, thank you for the presentations. I was just trying to put our speakers on spotlight, all of us, so that folks can see everybody. If you're there, John, could you just turn your video back on so I can spotlight you? You can only spotlight folks when their video is on. And Christina, I'll spotlight you too, because you've been working on our projects here in Australia. Excellento. I've got a couple of burning questions for our colleagues to start with. Thank you so much. It's been really great to hear about updates from your world and the things that you've been working on. This is, I guess, a question for all of you, Lyndon, John, Alan. How have you been finding the task of advocating to politicians in your own jurisdiction about ecocide? And can you share any tips on how to get their interest? Feel free. And particularly, maybe John, you could start, because I mean, you're fundamentally trying to chase a government as difficult as ours in terms of talking to government reps about recognising ecocide, whether nationally or internationally. What kind of efforts have you guys made, and how do you get received?
Yeah, I think like anything, you know, it's all about two things. One, it's about empathy. You have to first, you know, talk to them first and get to know them as a person. I think sometimes we want to just like charge in there. I like to, at least I'm an engineer by trade, and just talking about the, you know, the issues and what we need to do. And it's time we need to do it. It's beyond time, but we have to remember they're human beings, and we just are the people coming up to them and they're asked 1,000 different things that are so important, right? Everything's important when they come to a politician. So we have to have empathy for them too, in the situation they're in, and start having like a, you know, get to know them first, and then kind of present, you know, the real merits and find a reason maybe why it might be important for them. And then the other thing is, oftentimes, you know, we want to go to the top and go to decision makers, but I think decision makers oftentimes are afraid to make big decisions because, let's face it, they rely on experts to tell them what to do. So I think some of the best ways that you can do it is find then their panel of experts. They might have one person, maybe they have 3 people around them, maybe they have 5 people on their staff. You know, maybe there's one of those people in there that you might have something in common with. You can befriend them and get to know them, and really make your pitch to that expert who has their ear and their heart, and that they can be the ones to make the decision, and then tell their leader, hey, this is an important thing. You know, this is, you can do this. This would be really good for your campaign and for your messaging and for your country, etc. And that would be a lot better resonation coming from their staff rather than from yourself. So,
excellent advice. And just before we hand over to that question to the New Zealanders, John, do you feel that the US will ever engage in the discussions about recognizing ecocide at the international level or even the national level?
Well, seeing that we're suing the Navy for damaging, committing new ecocide, the U.S. Army is one of the largest polluters in the world. You know, and one of the largest economies also happens to be in the United States, which profits from this.
Yep.
I find it very unlikely. it's still possible. I think we can never give up hope. I think we need to always keep fighting for it, and bigger miracles have happened in life, so why not this, right? But yeah, I mean, it's really hard. It's like, that's kind of the problem is, it makes them money, and so it's going to have to be kind of a sneak attack, I think, in order to get big countries like this to kind of make that change. So that's why I really think it's like, it's about Africa and the Pacific Islands. Those are small nations that have been disenfranchised. They have a lot of votes in the UN Council, and it's about democracy, and it's let's empower those countries first, get them to vote, and then then the big countries have to follow suit.
Yeah, that's exactly how we feel, John. Working in Australia sometimes feels like you're literally shouting into the wind as a hurricane blows your voice away, because we're dealing with this incredible entrenchment of fossil fuel oriented and environmental damage. But thank you for those kind words. And I think the more we all band together, we can continue to inspire, perhaps. But yeah, sorry, over to you, Lyndon and Alan. How are you guys going in New Zealand? I think you've had a little more success than us, but tell us about what your efforts have been, politically speaking.
The proof will be in the pudding, as the saying goes.
Yeah,
we engaged initially with the Green Party here, and as you would expect, we got a reasonably good response. So the Greens are kind of on side, but as in Australia and many places, they at the present time they're a minor party. And they're not actually driving the government. We're hoping, politically, that they may be a stronger force come September next year when the next election's held.
right.
We also basically wrote very politely to all of the other parties, the other major parties, and we were fortunate through our other colleague who unfortunately couldn't join us today, Bridget Inder. It's sort of who you know really, but we managed to get into fairly high level discussions with the responsible ministry and the responsible people at that represent New Zealand at the ICC, and we've been able at least to talk face to face via Zoom with people, and again, we're just hoping that at least they're aware of this initiative, and that when they do go to the next ICC Assembly of State Parties this coming December, that they won't be surprised by the fact that Ecoside is getting a lot of attention, as it will. Alan, anything?
Yeah, I mean, New Zealand's sort of tries always to be a really good international citizen. So there's no question that when the resolution is put to the Assembly of States Parties to include it as a crime, New Zealand will support it. I have absolutely no doubt about that. What New Zealand doesn't do, unless it's got some unusually strong reason to, is to be the person or be the state that actually puts the motion up. So that in New Zealand, everyone at the Foreign Affairs and Trade will say, yeah, that's a great idea, that's a great idea. But you feel like you're not really getting any traction because they don't actually do anything about that. Although, they'll have legal experts looking at the definition, and they'll nod knowingly at the Assemblies of States Parties and stuff like that. But ironically, it's going to be someone like Vanuatu or the Marshall Islands or someone like that, or Tuvalu, that puts that'll because they've got a vested interest in getting this thing done as quickly as possible. So there's that really weird dynamic in New Zealand. The other thing, just picking up on something that John said, the US isn't a party to the International Criminal Court at the moment. So the US has said, in terms of the war crimes, if I can put it crudely like that, that they can't afford to have personal responsibility for its armed forces because it just doesn't work for them. They've got their own ways of doing it. They pride themselves on not acting unlawfully in war, and if something happens, then they also pride themselves on having good internal systems to deal with it, and they don't need someone else, thank you very much, poking their nose into that.
Yeah.
But the reason I raise that is that, having said that, the US were a major player informing what the Rome Statute provisions looked like. So it had serious input into that. They weren't obstructive, but they had serious input into that. And I would expect that the US will also have serious input into what the crime of ecocide says and how it fits in. But I don't think that, I agree with John, I don't think the US will join in, because it just doesn't suit them to do that. And there's a few of the major states that aren't, parties to it. So, yeah, so I'll leave it there.
No, that's good. Thank you. I've actually had a private question. Someone says they're embarrassed to admit, but they don't understand the difference between the ICC and the ICJ. I don't know, Alan or John particularly, would you like to just give the basics of how this stuff works and how the Rome Statute fits in? And then we might come, Peter Best has asked a good scenario question in there, which I see John has answered, but we might actually then talk about what is ecocide versus what is something that would probably already still be a crime under basic environmental laws now. But yeah, ICJ, ICC. Alan Keen, you go, Alan.
Well, I mean, I'll leave John, but that the ICJ is a venue for disputes between states, so that if America thinks that China's doing something wrong, and it's normally territorial disputes or what have you, then they submit the case to the ICJ, and the ICJ will produce an opinion about who's right and who's wrong, and then it's up to the states whether they accept that opinion or not, or whether they just carry on, notwithstanding that they've had the legal position set out for them. The ICC, however, is different in the sense that if something's referred to the ICC, and it can be by a state or it can be on the prosecutor's own motion, they're usually identifying a person that's responsible for the event, and they will have personal liability for if they're found guilty. And, the obvious examples that we all know about are the people that are committing war crimes, and so they are prosecuted, and then if they're found guilty, they have prison terms. And so that's the key difference in my view, but John might want to say something else about that.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, no, that this thing is perfect. Yeah. And I think the key with the ICJAO is just that, they're trying to get this opinion, which I think is brilliant to do now, because it kind of sets the stage before we even get into a dispute. Let's go ahead and define it, rather than after the fact when someone wants to try to bend it in a certain situation. I think this is a really good idea to kind of get ahead of the game. So brilliant.
Yeah.
And in terms of Vanuatu, John, or anyone, you were mentioning with the UN update that Vanuatu is kind of really starting, obviously, because it's in so much trouble with climate change. Can you talk a bit more about what they're arguing, where they're arguing it, and what their chances are for making change?
I mean, really, it's just they're a very small country with not a lot of resources, just trying to stand up and do their part. I think I feel like Vanuatu is the metaphor for the typical climate activist, the poor person working 9 to 5, just trying to raise their voice in this giant crowd and doing what they can. So just like that, we have to come to their aid. We have to help spread the word. We have to do what we can. We have to call our networks. We have to, especially our civil groups, a lot of our organizations and NGOs that maybe have just a nexus to the ICJAO or climate change. We need to get them involved and say, hey, this needs to go out in your network. Hey, I need you to spread this, because they don't have a lot of resources. We've been talking with them. They don't have a lot of experience. And I say that nicely, just because, these are young, lads that are working really hard and doing it, but they haven't been here before. So they're going to make some mistakes like we all have. So the key is, just like biodiversity, we have to come to their aid. We have to be diversified and bring those there. So that's the biggest thing I can say is, awesome to them, but it's up to us now to make the difference,
Thanks, John. And we don't have any direct connections yet to the Vanuatu folks around the Ecoside space. So we'd love for you to introduce us. And here in Australia, Christina and I will do our own humble efforts to connect and amplify whatever it is that they're advocating for at the moment. So not what it is, but what they are doing. So it's one of the reasons we wanted to host today, was to start sort of a larger conversation about how we can connect together in our region. So much of the Stop Ecocide International is kind of in the Northern Hemisphere, and they all go to these big New York meetings and they go to the things in Europe, and you can see they're kind of caught up in their own importance, which I respect. But those of us down under, and that's most of us on this call, we've got our own offerings and our own ways of doing things. So the more we band together, the stronger we might be. And I think our tips to each other about our governments are more relevant too. So please do keep us in the loop. We'll do our best to promote good things.
We'll do, yeah. And if you want to gather people that are interested, you'll get their emails together and then reach out to me, and I'll make an informal introduction to you guys directly. Or
Yep.
we'll make it happen.
That's good.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Lovely. And so, Lyndon, I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about the day-to-day work that you guys are involved with in New Zealand in terms of, how you're advocating to folks about Ecoside and how you're doing your day-to-day, because my understanding is all of the sort of branches of Stop Ecocide International are all volunteers. I know we're just doing it because we looked around and realized in Australia there wasn't a space to get engaged around Ecoside. Lots of folks mention it, but we're trying to build a bit of a place for interested folks to come into. But how are you guys doing your work in New Zealand?
Thanks, Michelle. That's very true here too. Of course, we're all volunteers on this, so we're kind of juggling all kinds of different aspects of it. But we've focused on a couple of things. The radio, we've had radio interviews with a national radio station, and that so that gets picked up, and it's archived on the web for people who want to go back and have a look for it. We've done a number of these kinds of events now. I think we've had 4 or 5 of them altogether where we've engaged with different folks. Alan and I did one just a couple of days ago with the Legal Wise people, a group of lawyers. We've done one with the ecologists. There's an umbrella group here, a little bit like what you have there, you guys with Ayla. It's called Eco here. And it's an umbrella group for many of the environmental NGOs. So it includes groups like Greenpeace. The largest conservation NGO is called Forest and Bird here, the Royal Forest and Bird Society. It includes about 40 or 50 such groups, and we had a really good webinar with those folk a while back, and a preliminary one with a few of them before that. So it's a slow process, and I think everyone realizes that this isn't going to happen overnight as much as we all wish it would. I think the international campaign is looking at somewhere between 2 and 7 years. I'd love it for it to be 2 years, but my understanding is that it won't be proposed at this next coming Assembly of State Parties. So we're still building momentum, if you like. The main thing I think, if we are to get this to succeed, is to get the governments to support it, as Alan pointed out. And I know it's going to be a hard task in Australia, but you never know. Australia's party to the ICC, and we just have to keep working at it.
That's right. You never know. And I think it comes down to a belief that these are the things we must do. It's the same with Ayla advocating for Indigenous first laws in a colonial nation, and advocating for earth-centered economics at a time when growth economics dominates the system. We know, and many of us know, the work that has to be done, and we just keep going. And you don't know whether what Will Stephan, our wonderful Aussie scientist who was part of the sort of planetary boundary space, what he says is the natural systems have their tipping points, but social systems have tipping points too. The standard cliche is no one really knew when the Berlin Wall came down so quickly. No one knew that was really going to happen. So we don't know how fast or slow social activities can push. So we just got to keep doing the work, which is great.
Hey, Michelle, sorry to butt in. I've stuffed up my timing because of daylight savings here in New Zealand.
You have my sympathies. Daylight savings is very tricky.
I'm still half asleep, so look, I'm going to have to cut out. I'm really sorry.
That's totally fine, Alan. We'll see you again soon. Don't worry. But thank you so much for your time. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Alan.
See you. Bye.
Thanks, Alan. Yes, next week, Australian eastern side of the continent changes to daylight saving, except where I live. So it's going to be crazy. What I was going to do, Peter has asked a good question, and I thought we might use it as a way of just quickly exploring this new expert, the new definition of ecocide proposed by the expert panel. So it's not enshrined in law yet, but it is the one that's being presented by specialists, particularly European. And I have to say, here in Australia, sorry, I keep thinking someone's coming into the room. There's a funny noise. I think it's the wind. I think in our Australian working group, we have a couple of folks who like the new definition and a couple who really don't like it. So we're exploring different scenarios. So let me just put this to you guys. So Peter has said, if it was in, oh, hang on, got the wrong bit. Hang on. If a Kiwi, and for those who don't know, that's what Aussies call New Zealanders. If a New Zealand hydropower dam collapses because of earthquake or intense rain, and there were discovered to be design flaws, would the designers be liable to face eco charges? Is this similar to Red Hill fuel facilities and unrepaired links? Now, John has said, in short, no for the hydro dam and yes for Navy. And you've referred to the new definition. So let's just take a step back. And then I thought the four of us could have a chat. So if an activity breaches its regulated allowed activities, theoretically, that damage that it causes would already be covered by whatever regulatory system was saying, yes, you may build a hydro dam, but you must make sure it's safe. You wouldn't actually even need the law of ecocide to say, oh my God, what have you done? If a site creates contamination, then theoretically existing environmental law should cover that. However, I might go to you, John, because you've said, in short, no for the hydro, yes for Navy, and the key difference is. Over to you, John.
Yeah, and I'll just premise this with, I would say, this is a hypothetical, right? There's a lot of things we don't understand here, but I would just say, it really comes down to wanton and reckless, and typically what we're talking about and what would be most likely standing is basically people profiting from these decisions, knowing that these are bad, still moving forward with it. Design flaws, engineering, with climate change, there's a lot of factors we don't know. We use design factors. I think there's a pretty big buffer there that, again, that they should be covered by liability. And again, like you said, they may be liable for other laws and regulations, but Ecoside is really for, they knew exactly what they were doing. It's like murder, it's like you knew what you were doing. You have to have contempt. It was like not an accident. It was, it was intentional. And that's why, like we say in the Navy, I say, no for designing and not understanding the flooding and raining and things that are maybe may not know. But the Navy, I mean, time and time again, they've been proven to be lying and misleading intentionally, and I think that's really the big difference here. Deep sea mining, that would be a good one where it's like, I think a lot of scientists can argue and say there is knowledge of doing that, but they may be able to argue and say we haven't done enough deep sea mining to say for sure that it is, truly damaging and it's going to destroy the biodiversity at the bottom of the seafloor. So hypothetically, that unfortunately might seem clear cut to us, but might become difficult in the courts. But my understanding and the thought process that I've heard, really, it's these corporations that are exploiting, doing fracking and oil, and basically have a history of damages, and they're just contributing to that same history. That's just
Thanks,
my
John.
thoughts and my opinions, though.
No, thank you, John. And Lyndon, did you have anything to comment on that scenario?
Yeah, look, I think it's covered pretty well with the wanton aspect. And, if people are interested, the website, stopecocide.earth, the commentary there that goes with the draft definition.
Please hold. Here's one we prepared earlier. Christina, would you like to open up the page? I mentioned to Christina that we might show this. So you keep talking and then I might just read through, and there's a couple of points in here, and it's particularly for the Aussie audience. A number of the Australian working group don't like this definition, and in the local domestic laws that they're going to be modelling and creating and speaking about won't have some of these bits. But let's talk about, sorry, Lyndon, you go for, continue please, and then we'll come back to this.
Yeah, so the definition obviously deals with that aspect quite well. I think it really does hinge on wanton. It also, of course, hinges on the level of damage that's caused. If the tailings dam or if the hydro dam lets go, but it doesn't do any long-term or widespread or irreparable damage in the flood that's released, then it certainly wouldn't be considered to be ecocide. If, however, it washed away the last remaining habitat of the still extant moa that that are here somewhere that we haven't discovered yet, then it could potentially be considered an ecocide. So these things would all have to be tested, and that was one of the major points that the panel that wrote the draft definitions said. They didn't actually give it examples, and they said, look, we're not giving examples of ecocide because we can't give every example, and there could well be ecocides that we can't think of, and it will need, individual cases will need to be tested on their merit. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Lyndon. And yes, I've just brought up here the international legal definition for ecocide. I'm not sure where Michelle has gone. Are you there, Michelle? I'm not sure if she's dropped out.
Well, yeah, so for those who are interested, there is a fair degree of commentary that actually explains the choice of these particular words. The panel, 12 people, certainly there was influence, strong influence from the US and the UK in the panel, even though the US is not signatory to the ICC, but there were also people from I think Bangladesh, from Mauritius and France, from Brazil maybe. So it was a very broad panel that worked on this, and they were very mindful of the terminology that had been used in the other 4 crimes that are already included on the ICC. So the wording has been thought through quite carefully. I think that one of the issues that people have is the fact that it says unlawful or wanton. So people were concerned that there might be lawful acts that could be considered to be ecocide. That's a sticking point for discussion. My understanding of it, and I'm no lawyer, but my understanding is that this was the reason that wanton was included, because something could have been considered lawful at the time, but the way that the act was conducted was not considered to be lawful under the ICC definition. So I think that's my interpretation of it. But I think, as I mentioned, this is a draft, and it's unlikely that that the final definition will be the same as this. Polly Higgins had a different definition, and the panel took that into account as well. So, way back, when Dalton first came up with it back in 1970, he had his own thoughts on it in terms of what had happened in Vietnam. So it's come a long way since then.
Thanks.
Sorry I dropped out, everyone. Michelle here. Thanks for handling everything, Christina. I just wanted to say thank you for that, Lyndon, and I'm not sure how much I missed. But yeah, it's that unlawful aspect that folks in Australia, many commentators are very unhappy with, but we also understand the rationale for why it's been put in there. And I apologise if I missed any comments from David about the definition. Please do continue. I'll just keep listening.
Lyndon was just speaking to, the problems with unlawful being in the definition.
What are your thoughts on it?
Yep. Oh, sorry.
Do continue. Yeah.
I was going to say, I don't know if they're problems or if they're solutions. The people that thought this through have hundreds of years of legal jurisprudence behind them. So they've gone down this path, and I'm sure as this develops further, there'll be a lot more explanations of why, in particular, the wording was chosen that has been.
I actually did sit on a webinar with Jojo Mehta, and she did speak to the reasons why they included lawful in the definition and unlawful, and that was because there was a lot of concerns that governments wouldn't adopt it if the definition was too wide and was going to attack lawful activities. So they were trying to kind of make it more easy to pass through the ICC.
I think, as John mentioned earlier, a good test case that we could, we could hypothesize about is the deep sea seabed mining. That's because it's a hot topic at the moment. There are the BBNJ, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction treaty is being negotiated. It's kind of fallen over a few times. It got close a couple of weeks ago. It's still not in play. It's meant to set aside 30% of the oceans as marine protected areas, which would be a terrific conclusion if we get there. But at the same time, we've got the regional fisheries agencies, and we've got the International Seabed Authority, and they're all vested interests, if you like, in the area, as it's called. And so, the deep sea mining, it's likely to be lawful, but if it's not conducted appropriately, it could easily be considered a wanton act if it's chewing up the seabed in a
I hope so, Linda.
Yeah, so this is,
yeah, because
I think,
how
a really important one.
Right off. Yeah. Sorry, mate, I didn't mean to cut across you. I was just going to say, I hope that they would find that it's wanton, but know what happens when big interests start projects. Nothing can stop them sometimes.
And I think the other problem too we might run into is, the first people that will benefit from these
Sorry,
projects are going to be.
Sorry, what was that?
I think I've got a terrible lag. Just ignore me. I'm going to be quiet. You keep going.
It's been real quick. I was just saying, that these will be countries that will oftentimes be benefiting from these actions, and so the real problem will be when some Pacific Island country or another island country is economically benefiting from deep sea mining. Now it kind of gives rise to some sort of economic benefit or social justice that's happening, in this act, and that's something we have to really be careful of. So again, this is a topic that I think is very important. We got to keep our eyes on.
Well, just last week, that Nehru, talking about Pacific nations, and the metals company are looking for an exploratory permit, and that's expected that it could be issued by the International Seabed Authority in the next month, which would again get the ball rolling in terms of exploratory work. There are 31 permits. I recommend anyone who hasn't had a look at the International Seabed Authority website to do so and have a look at the deep sea bed and how it's already been carved up for mining, or potentially for mining. There is a high seas conservation coalition that's working very hard to have a moratorium put in place, and I think that would be a very wise thing to do at this point, because we simply do not have the scientific information on the biodiversity that's there, on its on the time it takes to recover, which is, I think, a key aspect of the definition. Recovery is mentioned in there, and that's a really important point, because certain ecosystems recover a lot quicker or slower than others, and the deep sea, from the work that has been done and looking at trawling in the deep sea, there's been no recovery in places over decades, and it could be hundreds of years longer potentially. So there are a lot potentially long term, and again that's mentioned in the definition. So I think the more that I've looked at it, and I think that there's an incredible lot of potential wins here in this definition. I'm quite enthusiastic about it, to tell you the truth.
And just one thing I think we should remember ourselves. I mean, I think Lyndon has explained quite well. Like there's a lot of arguments, and you think he's articulated that this is a great case. And I think with anything, our minds always like to try to find the fault in things rather than what's right with it. And the reality is, there's a lot right with this. There may be some things that are questionable, but in the reality, this is a time we have to be bold, and that means we have to be comfortable failing forward than it is sitting still and getting it perfect. Perfection is what's going to kill us more than anything. So we just have to move forward, get this law in there, and then if there's changes, then try another campaign to ratify it. But it just has to move forward is the key here.
Pick it up.
Lyndon, I can repeat the question.
Okay, thank
I
you.
was speaking to the fact that ALIS actually created an Australian People's Tribunal. So this is a space where citizens can come together and discuss kind of any concerns they have around the current legal system. And it's not a court that can enforce things. It's not a proper court, but it's more of a normative exercise where people can raise their issues and come up with alternatives and ideas of how things can be done better. And she was saying, what do you think about these ideas of people's tribunals? Like, do you think that's something useful that can be done?
Oh, well, for certainly, yes. I think it's a great idea. Anything that that engages the public, you know, that's been part of our problem. We haven't been able to engage enough people to really push this hard. So, you know, I'm all for people's tribunals. I think anything that we can get, you know, engagement with people is the way forward here, and because I think once people understand the issues, then most people agree. You know, they see that this is a wise thing. John?
Yeah, and to this point, I think he's right. I think that the first thing is getting people engaged, and like the more they talk about it, the more that they'll be vested in these decisions, and then, you know, be more engaged in other things. I mean, the other part is too is if you come up with solutions from there, I mean, that's the fodder that I think we need in these rooms, in these discussions. So if you have arguments that you've come to, I mean, those could be brilliant ideas that nobody's talked about, and those things just need to be, you know, sent over to the teams that are negotiating these things. I mean, those could be the winning arguments. So absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. And I think that segues really nicely to a shameless plug on our end. We're actually launching our People's Tribunal event this evening. I have some slides. I'll just share that now. So this evening we have our launch event from 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock this evening. So if you would like to know more, do tune in. We've got some excellent guest speakers. We've got Sue Higginson, who's a Greens MP in New South Wales, who was a former Environmental Defenders Office lawyer, as well as Sheena Gilman, who has extensive experience in civil society with BirdLife Australia. So it's going to be really excellent, and we do encourage you to come along. And if you can't come along, it will be recorded. So thank you so much to everyone for tuning in. Thank you to our speakers. We hope that you got something out of this event and that you're feeling excited for the future of the Ecoside campaign in the Pacific. Alrighty, thanks so much everyone, and wishing you a beautiful day.